Hey guys, Ryan Nelson here, and today is the big one, the one I've been excited about. We're comparing the Canon EOS R5, this new beast of a camera, versus this camera over here, which is the Canon EOS R, which came out a little over a year ago. Maybe it was 2 years ago at this point. I don't know. When did you come out? I've had you for a little while, but I like you. I like you a lot. Do I like this one a lot? Short answer is yeah, I do. But we're gonna take a look and see how these two cameras stack up against each other. If you're looking at the EOS R or the R5, do you need to spend the extra money for the R5, or will the Canon EOS R do for what you need it to do? There are some situations where it will work. But this camera, this R5, it is pretty awesome as well. I'm guessing you're watching this because you either have the R and you want to see if the R5 is worth an upgrade, or you're just looking for a camera. So my question to you right away is, which other cameras have you looked at? Go ahead and drop that down in the comments. I'm curious to see what other cameras you have as contenders for your next camera purchase. And while you're down there, if you want to go ahead and support this channel, if you want to click on one of my Amazon links, one of my B&H links, if you buy something through that, I get a small commission off that. That helps me make this channel, create these reviews, comparisons, things like that. Or if you don't want to buy anything, you just want to support me on Patreon, that's down in the description as well. So let's go ahead and get into this comparison, see how these two cameras stack up to each other. Let's do it. So comparing the internal 4K recording on these two cameras seems like a good place to start. Now, just for reference, here are the internal 8-bit recordings out of each of these. Definitely a lot more contrast than I would like to start off with. I'm not going to talk about these too much, but I did want to show you these just for reference. Now, the ones I wanted to take a little bit deeper dive into are the C.RAW recordings. Tend to shoot C.RAW, you get a lot more range with this, a lot more versatility in your editing. So we've got our 8-bit C.RAW out of the R, our 4K 10-bit C.RAW out of the R5, and then our 4K HQ 10-bit C.RAW out of the R5. The 4K HQ recording is looking a little bit sharper than the other two. Colors across the board, very similar, but slight variations in the three. Now, as we zoom into 400%, we can really see the differences in these three. Again, colors, slight variations, but nothing too far off. You can definitely tell that the 4K HQ recording is the crispest out of the three. The one that's looking the least sharp is the recording out of the R. Then we have the R5 4K recording, and then the R5 4K HQ recording is definitely looking the best. And that's not too surprising, considering the 4K HQ recording on the R5 is basically taking a downsampled 8K image from the entire sensor, which you do not get on the EOS R. Now, if you've shot the EOS R in the past and you wanted to get the best quality out of it, you had to pair it with an external monitor to get a 10-bit 4K recording. Now, the nice thing about the R5 is you can shoot 10-bit internally, which allows you to go with a more compact setup. But does that translate into a better or worse image? So let's compare these. So here I have the external 10-bit out of the R, the internal 4K 10-bit out of the R5, and then the internal 4K 10-bit HQ out of the R5 as well. Kind of the same thing we were looking at before. Both are looking really good. The 4K HQ out of the R5 is looking ever so slightly sharper over the three. Not saying the other two are bad. You just notice a slight difference in the 4K HQ. And then zooming into 400% on these, again, slight variations in color. Noticing the 4K HQ is definitely the sharpest out of the three. One thing I do notice with the external recording out of the R is it's a little bit contrastier, and I'm getting a little bit more noise in the shadows, which I am actually kind of surprised about, because this has been a very, very solid recording in the past. So don't let that deter you too much, but just note that it is there, and we are picking up a little bit more detail in the shadows out of the internal 4K on the R5. Another big difference between the R and the R5 is the R has a crop sensor 4K recording. The R records full frame 4K. What's the difference here? So just for reference, here is the R5 full frame. Now we're looking at the R5 with the movie crop enabled. This is looking pretty good. And then compared to the EOS R, the first thing we notice is it's not as wide of a frame. And that's because the EOS R shoots 3840 by 2160. And that is the UHD ultra high definition, as to where the R5 shoots 4096 by 2160 or DCI 4K. Taking a look at these two zoomed in, you do notice that the R5 is just ever so slightly sharper. I know what you might be thinking at this point. Well, there's no motion in here, so how does the motion affect this? So let's take a look at this example. Again, for reference, full frame image, movie crop, and then the EOS R version. And if we zoom in down here on the traffic, zoomed in at 400%, overall everything's looking very similar, but there is a lot more noise on the image coming out of the EOS R. Now, if we look at the W up here on the red sign, you do notice that it is a little bit blurrier on the 4K HQ version, zoomed in at 650% versus the movie crop. Now it does look like you're actually getting a pretty crisp, clear image from the R5 with the movie crop turned on. To test out how much better the autofocus is on the R5, I set up this shot, a long lens, shallow depth of field to see how fast it picks up focus on a moving object. So moving away from it, they both pick me up. The R5 picks me up a little bit quicker, and then moving back, once the R5 locks onto me, it stays locked on. The EOS R, not so much. Now I did run this test multiple times with the same results. So for low light autofocus, this camera is actually doing really good. I can tell right now it's locked onto my eye with the eye detection on. As I move forward, it's still continuing to track. I am walking a little bit closer to a light, so of course it's gonna have a little bit more light to focus on. I'm getting a little closer. It knows exactly where to look. It's still locked onto my eye. Even as I move around this frame, this really, really dark, underexposed frame, I'm shooting about 1600 ISO, 50th of a second, f3.5, I believe this is. But as I'm moving around, I can still tell that this is locked onto my eye. It's still picking me up even in this highly dark, this very, very dark environment. The eye detect is still working very good in this low light, underexposed image. So good job, Canon. I like it. And then this is on the EOS R. As I'm standing close, I can tell it's jumping back and forth between the eye detection and the face detection. But I can tell immediately as soon as I start to walk backwards, it loses me. It loses my eye, it loses the face in this low light environment. So right here is about the threshold where it hits, it'll pick up my eye, and here it will drop off. And it won't pick up my eye, doesn't pick up my face, doesn't get much of anything back here in this low light environment. So eye detect on the R5, much better. Now, I found that these two cameras match pretty well. In this comparison, I'm shooting external on the Atomos recorder for the EOS R, and then internal 4K for the R5. Both are recording in C.RAW. Now, if we look at our lumetri scopes up here, you can tell they're very close to each other. All we have to do is bump the contrast all the way up for the R5 to match, all the way down for the EOS R to match. So color and contrast, relatively the same. One side note that I did not expect to notice while doing this test, if you look at my jacket, there's a lot more depth of field in the R5 full frame recording than there is with the crop recording on the EOS R. It's just something I wasn't expecting to see in this test, or at all, honestly. Then if we zoom into the color card a little bit, we can really get into our colors. Let's bump the saturation up on both of these so we can see the actual color difference. And looking down here at our color wheel, the colors are pretty spot on. The greens and the blues are off just ever so slightly. I have noticed with the Canon, the reds are always a little bit skewed towards the orange, but these colors are matching really, really close to each other. So if you want to pair these two cameras together on a shoot, you're not going to have too much trouble matching the colors from both of these cameras. A big difference between these two cameras is the ability to do time-lapse. Now, both of these, you can do a time-lapse movie, which compiles the time-lapse in camera and just spits out a video that you can just quickly add to your computer and have a time-lapse video. But the R5, you can also do an interval timer where you can do a photo time lapse, giving you a lot more control over the final image in your time lapse. Now, I do miss this feature in the EOS R. It's a simple feature. I'm not sure why they didn't add it to the EOS R, but it is in the R5 and I really, really dig it. Taking a look at these two examples, you can obviously tell that there's a lot more dynamic range in the photo time lapse from the R5 than the movie time lapse out of the EOS R. So I really dig the ability to do the interval timer in the R5. Another great feature of the Canon R5 is the IBIS, the in-body image stabilizer, which on this camera works in both photo and video mode. I have had some pretty great results in both modes. Now the Canon R only had a digital image stabilizer and that only worked in video mode. But the R5 has the digital image stabilizer along with the in-body image stabilizer, which pair amazingly well together. As a side note, the digital image stabilizer only works on video mode, not for photos. Doesn't work for photos. And to compare this, I wanted to take a look at the photos. Okay, I'm cheating a little bit here. These photos are actually shot on the R6, but it still does demonstrate the point of both the R5 and the R6 have the same in-body image stabilizer. So these are both handheld shots, half-second exposures. It's very hard to keep a camera still for a half a second, but you can tell on these examples that the IBIS is definitely helping out these handheld half-second exposures. You're getting a bit more of a crisp image with the help of the in-body image stabilizer. Now, the big difference between the R and the R5 for photos is the megapixel count. The R has about 30 megapixels, the R5 is sporting about 45 megapixels. Now, how does that translate into real world photos? Let's take a look. So overall, these look very, very similar. They have got, roughly the same colors going on, roughly the same gradients. If I showed you these two side by side, you probably wouldn't be able to tell them apart, tell me which one was from which camera. Now, sitting here taking a close look at these, it's honestly really, really hard to pick out the differences in the two. I mean, there is more detail in this image from the R5 versus this image from the R. But if I showed you these two side by side and did not tell you which one was which, you'd be pretty hard pressed to tell me which image came from which camera. There is some more detail in here. I've got finer gradients, but you have to look really, really close at the image from the R5 to really start picking out the minute details in these two. So the difference between 30 and 45 megapixels, yes, it's 15 more megapixels that you have in the R5, but for most scenarios, you're not gonna notice that much difference unless you're doing very, very extreme cropping or printing just massive, massive prints like billboard size prints. You're not gonna miss that extra 15 megapixels if you stay with the EOS R. One big advantage of the R5 is your ability to shoot C.RAW, which gives you a very high quality image without the massive file size. So unfortunately, between these examples, the light did change and I was so focused on getting the examples and making sure I knew what was what, I didn't notice that the light changed. Sorry. But given that the last example we looked at was a RAW versus RAW, let's look at the R5, a C.RAW versus a RAW image. So on the left, we have the C.RAW and on the right, we have the RAW. Again, these look pretty similar. Let's zoom into 200%, kind of take a look around this one, see if we can notice a huge difference in these two, given that this is the same camera, same sensor. So the file size in the C.RAW is 20 megabytes. The file size on the RAW image is 46 megabytes. That is less than half the data. And I don't think you lose hardly any quality going with C.RAW. Just flipping around this image, it's just as sharp, as crisp, as much detail as the RAW. Again, if I showed you these and asked you which one was which, chances are you'd be taking a guess. Just massive amounts of detail in these images. So to compare the shadow recovery on these two, I did this nice landscape shot, but I, accidentally underexposed. So the land here is nearly black. You can see a tiny bit of detail. And here's the same two photos with the exposure bumped up by 3 stops, and then the highlights and the whites brought all the way back down to -100. Clearly, we're getting shadow recovery on both of these images. But if we zoom in, actually still looking pretty good on both of these images. It is a little bit softer than I normally would like a landscape shot to look, but given that we're bringing shadows back from 3 stops underexposed, I think both of these do really well for shadow recovery. Pretty impressive on both of these cameras. Now, as far as highlight recovery on these two, taking a look at these, clearly the sky's a bit blown out. There's still detail there, so let's pull up the detail shots. Now, these have been adjusted to bring back the sky. They're different. I'm gonna say the light changed a little bit on these two, but zooming into the mountains back here, plenty of highlight detail recovery in there. Going up to the clouds, I think the R5 might be doing a tiny bit better of a job, but overall, accounting for the light change in these two images, both are recovering highlights quite nicely. So no particular preference on highlight recovery for either of these two cameras. Both do a good job. And then for studio samples, I wanted to take a look at these side by side. So let's go ahead and zoom into 200% on both of these. And I have to say, until I looked at these both side by side, like right now as I'm looking at these, I didn't realize how much more detail is actually in the R5 image. Granted, that focus may have jumped ever so slightly, so that may be skewing the perspective a little bit, but there is a lot more detail in the R5 image for this studio example. That being said, I have had 0 issues shooting with the R in studio. 30 megapixels is more than enough for a lot of the things I do. It's been more than enough for honestly everything I've done. And then hopping over to another example here real quick. Both of these, lots of detail. Plenty of detail, maybe a tiny bit more down here on the R5. Looking at the back end here, again, maybe just ever so much slight more detail down here. Now, both of these cameras are going to be good for in-studio work. One note, as of this recording, the R5 is not yet supported in Lightroom for tethering. Just a note. It will be someday. So is the R5 worth $3,899? There are some situations where it might be worth it for you to upgrade. If you really, really want the higher megapixel count for your photos. If you do a lot of low light photography, events, weddings, street photography, anything like that, that IBIS could be a huge benefit for you. If you want to get a really, really high quality image and you don't really want that big 40, 50 megabyte file sizes on every RAW image, shoot C.RAW. You can bring that file size down and still have all the capabilities of your RAW photo and not really lose much of anything. If you want to do photo time lapses, R5 is definitely worth it. If you do a lot of video work, the R5 is extremely flexible with what you can do with video. You've got your movie crop, you've got your full frame sensor, you've got 4K HQ, you've got 8K RAW, you've got 4K 120 frames per second. You've got just so much you can do with the video in this camera. It's seriously impressive. On the flip side of that, when is the R5 not worth this much money? If you just want to do photos like everyday photos, you're still going to get incredible photos with the EOS R. If you don't do a lot of low light stuff, you don't need that IBIS. If you don't shoot a lot of video work, these are situations where you might not want to spend several thousand extra dollars on the R5. Buy the EOS R, spend that extra money you have on some good glass. A good quality lens will get you better photos faster than a more expensive camera body will. Buy good lenses first. They also last you a lot longer than a camera body will. So to wrap this up, I really, really like both of these cameras. The R5 has its time and place. the EOS R has its time and place. There are many reasons you may want to spend the extra money and get the R5. There are many reasons you may not want to spend the extra money to get the R5. Both of these are just incredibly good cameras with unique features. You may not need all the unique features of the R5. I personally dig this camera. I really enjoy having it. And even in the month and a half that I've had this camera, I've already gotten a few shots that I would not have been able to get if I only had the R. It's just, I am so happy with this camera. I can see myself using this for at least 5 more years down the road. So that's what I have for you guys today. I really hope this helps you out making your decision in your next camera purchase. Let me know if you have any questions. Like I said, put that down in the comments. If you find this video useful, helpful, informative, anything like that, do me a huge favor, hit that thumbs up button down there, hit that subscribe button while you're down there, and I will see you guys next time.